When the great Maimonides was buried in Tiberias, it was 1204, and Egypt and Palestine were at peace. The kingdom of Jerusalem hung on to the coast, but it was not in active conflict, and people could move freely across the border, including Jews. But the surrounding world was in chaos, and over the next century, all of it would converge on this land. First of all, in the final year of Maimonides' life, the Crusaders had turned against the Roman Empire and taken Constantinople as a Crusader state. Pope Innocent III, who had very emphatically put his name on this crusade but had not intended Constantinople's sacking, attempted to rectify this act of cultural desecration by organizing a fifth crusade, but it didn't launch until after his death. Pretty quickly, the effort fell apart and most of the crusade leaders had gone home by the middle of 1218, so the remaining forces decided to defeat the enemy at its source by invading Egypt. But wait, I hear you say, if they couldn't capture Jerusalem with all of their forces, how could they capture Egypt with half of them? Well, one of those Jewish administrators may have been the Pope's personal physician, Philip, who would later go missing on a journey to Central Asia to secure an alliance with a mythical kingdom of noseless Christians ruled by a man named Prester John. Having failed to find Prester John in Central Asia, many Western thinkers concluded not that he didn't exist, but that he must be somewhere else, and the focus shifted to India. In 1221, rumors spread throughout the Crusader camp that the grandson of Prester John, a king named David, was leading a massive army up the Red Sea to aid the Crusaders, inspiring them to march on Cairo in what turned out to be a gruesome defeat. The Crusaders were nearly wiped out, and Europe's appetite for crusading largely went with it. Except, the same power struggle between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire, which had broken into full-on war in the 1160s, had only grown in scale by the 1220s. During the Fifth Crusade, the King of Sicily, Frederick II, had become Holy Roman Emperor, surrounding the Papal States and kicking off a vicious blood feud with Pope Gregory IX that led to Frederick's excommunication. Having had an only marginal part in the Fifth Crusade, Frederick was in a perfect position to charm his way back into the Pope's good graces by retaking Jerusalem himself in 1229. As an added bonus, Egypt was preoccupied with a rebellion in Syria, so the Sixth Crusade didn't actually have any fighting. Egypt peacefully agreed to cede a bunch of territory, including Jerusalem, and Frederick agreed that the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque would stay under Muslim control and that Muslims could continue living in and traveling to the city. But not Jews, who were once again expelled from Jerusalem. For retaking the Holy City, Pope Gregory excommunicated Frederick a second time and declared him the Antichrist. Eventually, this would all lead the Holy Roman Empire to shatter into hundreds of de facto independent city-states and teach us an important lesson: that the people of Bologna can't even get water out of the ground without using a stupid bucket. The lesser-known Barons' Crusade of 1240 extracted more territory from Egypt, but it was all for naught, as just 4 years later, all of the Crusaders' gains over the previous couple decades were lost in a series of sieges by the Khwarezmids of Persia. Persia? What were they doing all the way out here? Well, they weren't invaders. They were actually conquering Jerusalem for Egypt, and at this point, we need to acknowledge that Persia no longer exists. By this time, the Mongols had expanded from their homeland in East Asia all the way to the Zagros Mountains and deep into the European plain. For most of Christian Europe, this unprecedented threat killed any interest in crusading for the time being, with one exception. In 1249, Louis IX led France on a solo crusade, this time taking the fight directly to the Nile Delta in order to cripple the Egyptian army before they could come to Jerusalem's defense. Unfortunately for Louis, the French army somehow didn't know that the Nile flooded every year, even though that's the thing that the Nile does. Additionally, Ayyub Sultan died and the country was taken over by his widow and his much more capable Turkish slave army, the Mamluks. Bogged down, starving, and refusing to go home, the French were slowly ground to dust, and King Louis was held prisoner for 4 years. France had been the last country in Europe with any semblance of a standing army, and now that they were out of the picture, the Kingdom of Jerusalem ended up making a truce with Egypt in order to focus on the Mongol threat, allowing Egyptian forces to march through and even station themselves within Crusader territory. In 1258, the Mongols finally captured Baghdad, and for a time wiped the city off the map. 2 years later, the Mongols attempted to invade Palestine, but the Egyptians turned them back at Ain Jalut in the Jezreel Valley, thanks in part to an exciting new experimental weapon, the cannon. With the Mongols defeated, The Sultan Baybars invited al-Mustansir to re-establish the Abbasid Caliphate in Cairo, solidifying Egypt as the center of the Muslim world. But here's the interesting thing. The peace between Egypt and Jerusalem continued for several years after the Mongols were defeated. And with that, we can finally start talking about Jewish history again. See, this period of de-escalation fundamentally transformed the Jewish community on both sides of the border. After returning to France in defeat in 1254, King Louis IX had expelled the Jews, in order to seize their assets and rebuild his army. Thousands were expelled, but perhaps the most notable victim was the Great Academy of Paris, the foremost yeshiva in the French domains, headed by Louis's old nemesis from the trial of the Talmud, Sir Vive Yechiel de Paris. After 4 years of exile in Catalonia, Yechiel brought his son and his students from the yeshiva to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, re-establishing the Great Academy of Paris in the Crusader capital Acre. But he was only the first. Around the time of Yechiel's death, another rabbinic master made his way east, Moïse Gerondi, better known in Catalan by his nickname Bonastruc Saporta, or in Hebrew as the Ramban, or in Greek as Nachmanides. And to make things extra confusing, Nachmanides was a student of Salomon de Montpellier and a cousin of Jonah Gerondi, the foremost leaders of the movement against the teachings of Maimonides. Although it was cousin Jonah who had instigated the burning of the Mishneh Torah by Dominican monks, he was also among those who defected to the Maimonidean side after realizing what he had done. Similarly, as chief rabbi of the county of Barcelona, Nachmanides had made a career unsuccessfully arguing for a middle ground between the Maimonideans and anti-Maimonideans, but he rose to superstardom when King James of Aragon called upon him to defend the Talmud against the Dominican friar Pablo Cristiani in the Disputation of Barcelona. Cristiani, who had been Jewish-born, had studied in the yeshiva of Tarascon before the expulsion by King Louis, and had only converted to Roman Catholicism later in life, believed that he could prove that passages in the Hebrew Bible and the Talmud proved that Jesus was the Messiah and was of a divine nature, leading Nachmanides to point out that the Jewish conception of the Messiah had always been entirely human and not at all divine, and that if Pablo truly believed that the great Sanhedrin had recognized Jesus as the Messiah, they would not have opposed him, insinuating that perhaps Friar Pablo had not been such a good student in the yeshiva. Although the church authorities unsurprisingly ruled in favor of Cristiani, King James, who had actually wanted to limit the power of the Dominicans in his lands, awarded Nachmanides 300 gold coins and, in a truly unprecedented act, addressed a Shabbat service as a guest of the great synagogue of Barcelona. "Never before," he said, "have I heard an unjust cause so nobly defended." But as a compromise with the church, James had Nachmanides' treatises burned and banished him to Castile for 2 years. When that exile ended, Nachmanides chose not to return to Barcelona. Instead, at the age of 73, he made Aliyah and established a synagogue in Jerusalem. At the time, only 2 Jewish families dwelt within the city's walls. But by virtue of Nachmanides' fame, more began to resettle there from the surrounding area, until the permanent Jewish population numbered over 1,000. This was the end of our exile. Never again would the Jews be absent from that city. In this time, the truce between Egypt and the Crusaders revealed its true nature. It was not a peace of mutual respect, but of military weakness, and Egypt was rebuilding. Throughout the 1260s, the Mamluks captured Haifa, Caesarea, Arsuf, and Jaffa, and the Crusaders did nothing. In 1271, the future King Edward Longshanks, he who would later expel the Jews from England, launched a 9th crusade, but his tiny contingent of 1,000 men was easily repelled. Edward had reached out for an alliance with the Mongols, but they too were spent. No further crusade was ever undertaken in the Holy Land. The kingdoms of Europe were broke. The Pope had turned his attention fully to the Church's feud against the Holy Roman Empire, which itself was in shambles. And in 1276, King Hugh of Jerusalem moved his capital from Acre to the island of Cyprus.
It's time, homie.
Over the next 15 years, the Mamluks continued to eat away at Crusader territory. When Tripoli fell in 1289, the Crusaders wrote to the Pope urging a 10th crusade. However, the European powers were preoccupied with political intrigue over the Aragonese occupation of Sicily. Instead, Just as when the Crusades had begun 2 centuries before, it was a handful of untrained, unpaid peasant volunteers who answered the call, raiding and slaughtering Muslim villages on the Bay of Haifa. In response to this, Sultan al-Mansur Qalawun declared war and began besieging Acre on the 12th of April 1291. A month later, King Henry II of Jerusalem arrived to find the walls of Acre standing, but the city was nevertheless in a dire state, days from falling to the enemy. Feeling that his 700 reinforcements were woefully inadequate, he began negotiations, but effectively refused to make a deal, as surrender was off the table, and his only offer was for the Mamluks to retreat unconditionally. The next day, the siege engines and mines that had so threatened the city for weeks breached the walls. Battle entered the streets, and the Crusaders devolved into anarchy. See, here's the thing. Just as had been the case 200 years earlier, the Crusader army was not a single army, but a collection of militant religious orders and Italian mercantile interests. King Henry himself had hastily retreated along with the Italians, taking most of the ships in Acre's port with them in a mad rush out of the city. Those who remained were ferociously divided over what to do next. By the 18th of May, the Knights Templar, Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Knights had fallen back to the Templar citadel. The Templars and Teutonic Knights negotiated to be allowed to leave the city, but the evacuation was halted after Templars killed Mamluk soldiers who had taken civilian prisoners. From then on, it was a fight to the death. On the 28th of May, the Templar fortress was wiped out and collapsed into the sea, where it remains to this day. Although the Lusignan dynasty still reigned on Cyprus, the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Crusades were no more. By the end of the 13th century, the Jewish population of Palestine had rebounded to 6,000, and there it would stay for centuries. Though Yechiel had brought the Great Academy of Paris to Acre, and Nachmanides had reconsecrated the Jewish presence in Jerusalem, and though England had expelled its Jews, and France would soon follow suit once more, no great exodus came to the land of Israel. For the opportunistic, this was a poor, environmentally ravaged land, a place better suited for shepherds than the merchants of Europe. In the name of religion, there was no great impetus to return. Maimonides himself had said in the Mishneh Torah that the great Jewish diaspora would surely return when the Messiah comes to restore the Davidic line, the independence of Judea, and the restoration of the Jewish temple. For those who had returned, it was not a matter of nation building, but of personal spirituality. In fact, even as the old Yishuv opened its doors to the world, Jews were still coming to live in entirely new and unfamiliar lands. The 14th century wouldn't see a great ingathering of Jews in Jerusalem, but it would see a handful of Jews in Western Europe begin a long, slow journey east. Special thanks to my patrons, including Jeremy Biskind, Eric Atreides, Lev Ham, Gary Davidson, Greg Maev, Vicky Nelson, Navet Tal, and Ur Weiss.